Good evening, Aziz. Thanks for making time to talk to me tonight. I think we've both been watching what's been happening on Capitol Hill today. I'm sure you've been watching the inauguration, and we might talk about that a little bit in a
Absolutely.
while. For those of you who don't know Aziz Abu Sarah is one of the co-directors and founders of Mejdi Travel, a company I've interviewed a few times now. But I wanted to speak to Aziz tonight, particularly because it seems to me that what's happened today on Capitol Hill is so much better than what was happening 2 weeks ago. But let's not talk about that, Aziz. Let's put that firmly in the history books. Actually, I'm sure it'll be in for a very long time. There'll be a lot of masters and dissertations, goodness knows what, written about those events 2 weeks ago. But let's look forward. And what I wanted to ask you about tonight is looking at it from here in Europe, well, offshore island of Europe now, but looking at it here from this part of the world, what I think I've seen happen, and I just want to try this out on you, is I think we've now got an American president who's going to be much more interested in the rule-based system of international relations, that we're going to go back to a world in which people come to agreements, they stick to those agreements. Is that your sense of what might happen? Can I be optimistic in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Biden already has made it clear that he's going to work with allies, that he wants to get back to being part of the WHO. He wants to be back of the United Nations and really be part of a community. The Trump administration position was focused on America first. The Biden administration seems to be more collaborative approach and working with others and not just putting America first. So it's totally different style of leadership.
Because it seems to me, Aziz, that one of the things our countries have in common, and there are, I mean, the old joke is that we're two countries divided by a common language, and to some extent, I think that's true. American is not the same as English. But having got that out of the way, it does seem to me that one of the things our two countries have in common is we've had a really bad experience with COVID. Neither
Yeah,
of us have dealt with it
unfortunately.
brilliantly well. And the problem, I think, from a travel and tourism perspective on this is that we can't expect to get back to international travel until there's an international set of rules around the basis on which people move between countries because of the COVID risk. Do you share that concern that I have?
Yeah, and I think what's happening now is every country is figuring it out for itself. So different countries have different rules, and it's really confusing for as travel is going to start happening again. And some people already traveling, even though I don't think it's a good idea to do it right now. But it's quite confusing because each country has different rules. Each country is looking at different kind of testings. Now, if you already had COVID, can you travel or not? If you got the vaccine, when can you start traveling? Which country is going to take you on? And it's so many different rules that eventually it's going to cause confusion, and people are going to go to airports and they going to figure out, oh, I don't qualify according to these rules. And I think a much better direction to move in is to have a much more unified rules and to understand where the United States, where Europe, where Asia, where Latin America is, and try to really come up with something that works for all of us.
Yeah, and it isn't just either. It's not just the vaccine, is it? Because the other concern I've heard tourists express to me, and I have to say it's one that I have myself, is that you may get on the plane, you may pass the COVID test, and you arrive somewhere and you're there for a fortnight. By the time you want to come back, you may have been locked out of your own country or put into quarantine where you are abroad. And either of those things then impose on you potentially enormous costs, which will be uninsurable whilst you sustain yourself in another country, presumably living in a hotel, as your credit card maxes out, and suddenly you're in real trouble about how you sustain your life trapped abroad or trapped when you come home in quarantine. So it seems to me that we've been able to assume for the last 40 years, basically, that you would get on a plane, go abroad, and get on a plane and come back again. But that assumption is gone, hasn't it?
It's absolutely not the way it works anymore. And then if you get COVID in a different country and travel back home, you are breaking the rules of your own country in many places at least. I know of cases where people got COVID, knew they had COVID, flew back, and eventually they got arrested because they endangered everybody with them on that plane. But like you said earlier, I don't think there's a clear understanding from people what they can do. And as much as I think it's irresponsible that people would do that, just like you mentioned, there's a heavy cost for people who would stay abroad if they get COVID while traveling. And health insurance companies now are not really gonna, travel insurance companies not interested, at least right now, into taking on that cost. If you can get travel insurance right now, you'd be lucky. Many companies are not really doing it.
It's interesting. I saw a news report today that in Thailand they're thinking of imposing a
Yeah.
tax on arrivals, and that tax is to cover two things. One is the cost of just keeping Thailand fit for tourists to visit, but the other part is to cover the costs of people who get admitted to hospital in Thailand and then rack up such bills that they can't afford to pay them. So the tourists can't pay, so the state needs to pay, and to do that needs to tax somebody. So it's going to tax the tourists, and that's the first example of this. But I don't suppose it will be the last if we don't get some kind of international system sorted out between the different countries.
Yeah, I was told, and I'm not sure to what extent it's happening, that in Greece, for example, they set up some hotels, and this was a few months ago, so I don't know if it's still happening. They set up some hotels that are only going to take people who are quarantined. So people who got COVID and need to be staying for an extra couple of weeks, and that the government is taking care of that in their effort to get tourism to restart. Again, I think restarting tourism a few months ago was way too early, but that was their way of doing it.
Yeah. So we have to hope, I think, Aziz, moving forward, that we get to a situation where there is some kind of commonly recognized process by which people get permission to travel. The airlines will then have more security about the passengers they're carrying, and we'll have more security about the other people on the plane with in terms of our safety. But it does
Yeah,
seem to me that negotiation is still quite a long way off.
I think as an industry, we need to figure out a lot of questions have to be answered. Airlines, hotels, best practices with COVID. I think each places are figuring it out right now on their own. And as tourism restarts, we would have to all come together, everyone working travel, and compare notes and figure out what's acceptable and what's not, how hotels need to behave, how airlines, what they need to do, and then borders, and then what happens if people got it, what happens with the vaccines. There are already talks about people traveling to other countries to get vaccines because those countries might be ahead in vaccines that their own. Is this something acceptable, not acceptable? There's quite a bit of work that we have ahead of us in the travel industry and into establishing that kind of rules. But I think you mentioned, international rules, and I think with the Biden administration, I hope it goes beyond just the health aspect and the COVID aspect, because with the previous administration, at least in the United States, traveling to the US had become very hard, not only for we heard a lot about people coming from Middle Eastern or Muslim countries, but it became harder for quite a lot of other people. Getting a visa to the US became much harder for tourists, for travelers, not talking about immigration. And I'm really hopeful that travel to the US would be easier, and travel to other places would be easier, as well as the world is hopefully learning how we can see each other as allies and not just as potential enemies.
Yeah. The thing that's occurred to me thinking today about the need to get back to a rules-based international system is that the other big problem where we are as an industry, we were big contributors to COVID. There's nowhere to hide on that. The fact that people are traveling around by aircraft between different places obviously is a vector for spreading the illness. But the other thing which we can't deny is that aviation is 3.5% of all global emissions, according to the latest figures from the IPCC expert on that.
Hmm.
That's a hell of a lot of it. I think we're the sixth, aviation would be the sixth biggest country if it were a country in terms of aviation emissions, and that's counting the EU as one country. So if you divided the EU up, we'd probably be fifth as aviation in terms of the scale of the problem. And it seems to me that that's another area where it's only ever going to be solved through an international rules-based system where all the airlines obey the same rules in terms of the carbon reduction that we know has to come if we're not going to make our world uninhabitable.
Yeah, and I think it's one figuring out the technology, and we know there's better technology already to bring the air pollution to be much lower. I think airlines, I think cruise ships, I think buses and cars and so on. And you look at at some cities like Dubrovnik, where they have more pollution coming from the cruise ships than they have from all the cars in the city. Those are important questions, and I think eventually it comes down to cost and to countries being willing to enforce rules and laws that says, yeah, cruise ships, fine, you can exist, but there's a limit to how much pollution you can make. Even coming to the trash that in some of the islands that travelers go to, uh, each in some of those islands, a cruise ship can stop and dump all the plastic they've had in a week-long journey, and this island will not have a way to get out that trash except by throwing it into the ocean. So we have quite a few aspects we have to rethink how we do it. And I'm not saying it as in, well, nobody should get on a cruise anymore, but I'm saying we need to rethink what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And the truth is, we as the travel industry will not regulate ourselves. In the sense, a company that's making an airline or a tour operator or a cruise ship that's making a profit of these things will not want to regulate those aspects. And at the same time, I do believe, considering how much travel brings income to local communities, we do need more help from governments to make those changes happen.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the two major forms of pollution, which if I do them here in Faversham are going to affect the whole world, are any kind of plastic waste that gets into the oceans through a river system, and obviously emissions of greenhouse gases. And those two forms of pollution, it seems to me, whilst they obviously all originate locally, they will immediately become a global problem. And at least for those two forms of pollution, and no doubt for others, we've really got to get to an international rules-based system for policing that kind of pollution and getting to somewhere where the polluter pays to clean it up and also as a disincentive to do the polluting in the first place.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think this idea that I only take care of my own and you take care of your own maybe works in some things, but on global challenges that we have, it absolutely doesn't work. On climate change, it doesn't work. On emissions, it doesn't work. On plastic in the ocean, which eventually affects our ability to eat fish in general. We can go into other industries as well, like overfishing and so on. You can't say, well, this is not my problem. And that's the challenge that people who believe in my country first, whatever, US first, UK first, this is becoming a popular thing. Philippines first, you see it all over the world. Yeah, you can deal with some internal political things. You can deal with the whole thing of bringing jobs back. I get the point of it. And in some areas, I can see why it's attractive. But when you're meeting global challenges, you can't say my country first, because you can do everything right and it wouldn't matter if you don't have a coalition of everyone, literally everyone on board.
It does begin to feel, it was beginning to feel, I guess, and I'm optimistic today because of Biden's inauguration, but it was beginning to feel as though we were sliding into a 1930s style triumph of individual nationalistic leaders, and there are still a significant number of those around the world. But at least America seems to have gone back to a more internationalist, rules-based approach to these issues. It will be interesting to see which executive orders Biden signs today, but I think, like you, I've got a great deal of optimism now that the world might be going to go in a different direction. but my goodness, we got very close to being in a very bad place.
I agree. I think he's about to sign about 16, 17 executive orders. One of them is rejoining the Paris Agreement. Um, but I wouldn't say things are changing yet, because I think this is a longer battle. And there's a lot of people who are still angry. There's a lot of people who feel cheated. There are a lot of people who feel their voices aren't heard. And the United States is heavily divided, just like the United Kingdom. I think Biden has a really hard job ahead of him, and his ability to work with some Republicans, to work and really bringing people together, to work and making people who are not benefiting today from the economic system realize that the way forward isn't necessarily nationalism, but it actually working together, putting those people ahead. I think that's important. The diminishing middle class is a big challenge for the whole world, for Europe as much as it is for the United States. So I really hope that Biden is able to meet some of these challenges. Otherwise, in 2 years, when there's another election, 4 years, I have to say, I don't see it really Republican Democrat. You can see within the parties, you can see elements that are really problematic. I mean, and those people are not even endorsed by those who understand what's happening. I can think of one member from Georgia who is just spreading crazy stuff literally on daily basis. Yesterday she was saying all the gun attacks in schools, these are false flags and stuff like that. And this is a member of Congress. And when people are suffering, sometimes they listen to ridiculous things because they want to blame someone.
Yeah.
And it will take working together. We can argue and disagree, and sometimes a Republican wins, sometimes a Democrat wins. But as long as we function within a framework we all agree on, that's okay. When we start going into off-base stuff and move toward authoritarianism, it's definitely scary, and I don't think we're out of that yet.
No, I agree. And it's not just an American problem. That's also clear. It's increasingly a problem around the world. Aziz, let's leave it there on an optimistic note. This could be the first signs of a big change. We're both perhaps waiting for the confirmation of that, and probably going to have to wait a year to see whether Biden's got it in him to do the healing necessary to strike out in a new dimension. But let's hope he has. Thanks very much for making time tonight, and I'm sure I'll talk to you again soon.
Always a pleasure.